Let me start us with a word of prayer. God, thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for this this very different kind of exploration of a book in your Bible. Give us eyes to see what's being said, eyes to and maybe hearts to hear what it means for us now. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. So hopefully you guys enjoyed a little bit of Ecclesiastes. He almost found some hopeful things to say last week, and I'm afraid it's pretty much like that this week too. He's almost finding some hopeful things. Uh, just as a way of kind of centering us in the direction we're going. We're looking at this story as a way to get a glimpse into the mind of God, and also to glean some language for the kinds of struggles that we all have as people. This book that is 2,500 years old has some very real and meaningful things to say about our lives today, even as we strip away some of the things that are bound to the time that it was written. And we'll see a few of those tonight. We've been saying that there's three themes in Ecclesiastes. There is a frustration with the lack of fairness in the world. There is a pretty clear note of disappointment in the way that God has set up the world. And then finally, there's an awareness and a struggle with mortality in this that is something that all grown-ups have to face, and it's comforting to me to find this language in the Bible amid all the happy passages and stories about how, gosh, if you're just faithful, everything will go well. We get Ecclesiastes that kind of tells it a little bit more as it actually happens. And so for that, it belongs in the collection of books that we call our Bible, because it gives us language like so many of the other books. Other books give us worship language. Some give us powerful words to share as we're communicating the gospel. Ecclesiastes gives us language for the struggle of daily life and of trying to find meaning in our life. There's a musician and poet that I like a lot. He's from Australia, and he's been around for a long time. I mean, for a musician, he's one of those that I think he's probably into his 60s now, and still touring, still recording, still writing. And they interviewed him in the New Yorker in a recent issue because he's also dealt with a lot of tragedy in his life. His name is Nick Cave. He got his start as the leader of a band called Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. So take that for what it's worth. But I'm going to put a quote up on the screen. It's a little bit of a dense quote, so I'm going to leave it there so you can read it as I read it out loud. But this is a really interesting expression of the role that grief plays in a reflective, even joyful life. And so let me, it's been a long time since I shared something on the screen, so let me remember how to do that. and then I'll read this out loud too. He's talking about grief and how you live through grief. And he says, I don't think this situation resolves itself as you grow older. In fact, more people die. Loss becomes the primary condition of living. That doesn't mean you're in a hopeless, grief-stricken state all the time. It just means that you carry a deeper understanding of what it is to be human. We suffer as human beings, but out of that can come enormous joys and genuine happiness too. It can run in tandem with this ordinary sense of suffering. Otherwise, joy doesn't resonate fully. Joy seems to leap forth out of suffering. And so, regardless of your loss, you see how beautiful, how meaningful, and how joyful the world can suddenly be. Human beings in general, are fleeting things. That's something to understand on a fundamental level, that we have value and that we're precious. Now, first off, you wouldn't expect these paragraphs coming from a post-punk rocker, and yet there it is. This is a guy who has suffered a handful of very deep tragedies in his life. Lost two children, 10 years apart. One of them 15, one of them in his 30s. And he has every excuse to revert back to his angry young man pose, or to just sort of chuck it all together. But he's always writing, always thinking, always trying to put language on this part of our human condition. And when I read this today, I actually read this as this morning, it occurs to me that Nick Cave does a better job than Coelet at incorporating the way that loss and the finiteness of life impacts our daily outlook. And it may be that by the time we get to the end of Ecclesiastes, this is where Coelet lands. But Nick Cave, who is a man of faith, a very kind of uniquely expressed, deeply held Christian faith, but he's come to this conclusion that we kind of wish Coelet would get to, that out of some of our sufferings, we find joy, and that if we didn't have sufferings to compare them to, the joy really wouldn't resonate as fully as it can. And then ultimately to come to the conclusion that because we're human, we have value and we're precious in a meaningful way to ourselves and to the people around us, the people who care about us. So anyway, that's a little, just so Ecclesiastes is asking questions and talking about these things in a meaningful way, but so are other people. And in some ways, so are some other people that you might not expect. So if you're of an exploring kind, maybe Google Nick Cave and grief, and there's a lot that he's written about the experiences that he's had. And it's possible that our little journey through Ecclesiastes might give those excerpts, those articles, a little bit more meaning for you. Ecclesiastes comes in a body of literature in the Bible called the wisdom literature. Very important for us to understand that, especially tonight. The wisdom literature is the parts of the Bible that talk about what it means to live in covenant relationship with God and with each other. In other words, the wisdom literature is about the day-to-day living of the life of faith. The histories can be about kings and the laws about the law, but these writings that are called wisdom literature, they're like, what are you going to do next Thursday? How are you going to live a faithful life tomorrow? And Proverbs and some of the Psalms, and I think Lamentations and Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, these are all parts of the wisdom literature, part of the Bible. Ruth was a story rooted in wisdom literature, because it just talked about a bunch of people trying to do the right thing according to the covenant that God had made with them. And so Ecclesiastes turns a little bit of that on its head, because the wisdom literature creates the impression that if you do all the right things, the right outcomes will happen. If you live by faith, you'll walk in, glory next to God. Well, I'm sure that's true sometimes for people, but a lot of people don't experience the life of faith that way. And so Ecclesiastes gives us kind of the dark side of wisdom literature. And we've been saying this from the very beginning, that the very first line of the book is meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. That's kind of the main point of the book. we also have been saying that, what do we gain from working hard at our life and working hard at growing in our faith? Kohelet makes it sound like we don't get anything if we haven't expanded our lifespan. The fact that we die, the fact that all of us die, seems to gall Kohelet. It really gets under his skin. And so I think that's a blind spot for the speaker in Ecclesiastes, and maybe it's left in there for us to identify that as a blind spot and to try and do better. So, but part of the lesson in the book is that a lot in our existence is out of our control. Yes, I've gotten a triple dose of that in the last month. A lot of the things that happen to us and with us and to the people we care about, a lot of those things are out of our control. Last week we looked at chapter 4, and we started to see Kohelet talk about covenant life, which was his entree back into more closer to the bullseye of wisdom literature. Remember that the covenant that God made with Abram in Genesis 12 says, "You'll be faithful to me, I will bless you, and you will go out and be a blessing to the nations." So the ethics part of that is really the second two, the second and third of those three sentences. God is God. We respond by being faithful to him. God gives us blessings, and then we turn around and share those blessings with everybody else. That is the essence of the covenant. Even Jesus, when he's teaching, they ask him what the most important commandment is. That's what he says: love God and love your neighbor. Everything else hangs on this. And so the wisdom literature, it talks about that. And in chapter 4 last week, we saw where Kohelet turns back to those two things, loving God and being people who administer justice in the world. In chapter 4, Kohelet says that caring for other people is a part of living covenant life. He said, "Again, I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter." And then he goes from there to, in chapter 4 last week, to this thing that, look, life is hard, better not to do it by yourself. And you get this great passage that Shelley and I had read in our civil ceremony: "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up, but pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up." And I wanted to make sure that I was clear last week. That's not about necessarily making sure you have somebody in your house. It's about making sure you're involved in a community. I think that's the hopeful thing. For the years that I lived by myself, I had a community of friends that I could lean on. And that was very important for me. Kept me sane enough to be the person I needed to be when I met Shelley. And so all of this brings us to chapter 5, where Kohelet starts to turn a corner a little bit. Remember that the two parts of the covenant are love God and be a blessing to others. In the prophets, which are contemporary, actually the prophets, the prophetic writing is probably before Ecclesiastes. Remember, the prophets are contemporary with the kings, and Ecclesiastes is written after the exile. There are no more kings by the time Ecclesiastes is written. So Ecclesiastes recognizes that in the prophetic books in the Bible, the two things that get God angrier than anything else are faithless, loveless worship and a failure to provide justice for the weak. In Isaiah, it's that right from the very first chapter of Isaiah. You know, if you were with me during the Amos study, that's the point of the book. And so God really has two triggers: insincere, unloving worship and denial of justice to people. So in chapter 5, here are these two different ways of talking about that covenant responsibility. Kohelet starts chapter 5 with some teaching about worship. He says, guard your steps when you go into the house of God. Go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who don't know what they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. In other words, don't be frivolous with the time that you have devoted to the worship of God. It's another more subtle but also more pointed way of saying insincere worship is the problem. Worship that doesn't have any love for God or awe of God. Worship that's just going through the motions. That's the part about the sacrifice of fools. Insincere worship is what drives God away from us, not toward us. And so he's saying, don't be quick with what you say. Be careful what you say in worship. Don't be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. And then there is that reminder that God is God and we're not, which is a healthy reminder that all of us need to give each other and ourselves every day. Remember that that God is God and that you are not. Should all look ourselves in the mirror in the morning and remind ourselves that makes the rest of the day much better. And so chapter 5 takes this weird turn. He goes right into be sincere, loving, faithful people in worship, or keep your mouth shut. That's the implication here, right? Don't say anything. Let your words be few. He continues by saying, starting in verse 4, when you make a vow to God, don't delay to fulfill it. In other words, don't make promises. I'm tempted to say don't make pledges and not fulfill them. But don't make, it is stewardship season after all. Don't make pledges and promises to God, and then don't make them frivolously with no intention of fulfilling them. It's better not to make a vow in verse 5 than to make one and not fulfill it. You know, this could be a good companion reading to the ordination and installation of church officers and pastors. We're all up there taking vows. I should probably read this first. So we're meant to be sincere in worship. God respects sincerity and authenticity clearly, even in doubt. But what God apparently does not like very much is going in and saying all these holy things with no intention of fulfilling those promises. Again, it's back to the idea of covenant. God's made a promise to us that requires a return promise back to him. And when we don't fulfill that promise, we are left out of the covenant. Remember, the exiles happened because Israel continually refused to fulfill its side of the covenant. And what was the covenant? To worship God sincerely and to provide justice for all the people. And so Kohelet makes that turn also. He talks about the second part of covenant life, how we treat others. how we share the blessings of God with other people. Starting in verse 8, he says, if you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, don't be surprised. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both are others, both have others higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all, and the king himself profits from the fields. Now, clearly, you just heard that. Maybe you're reading it too. There's nothing in there that says, go out and defend justice. It's expected to understand that from that. It's expected that when a good Jewish faithful person hears God or reads the scriptures that say, look at all the injustice out here, that we know we're meant to do something about it. And so, Kohelet being Kohelet, he dives into the reasons for injustice more than the remedy for injustice. And so if you skip down to verse 10, he says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. And then, because this is the chorus for every verse in this book, this too is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? It's an interesting little riff here that he's associating the lack of justice, the lack of economic justice in the land, with people who are hoarding too much wealth and who aren't even enjoying it as they hoard it. Does that part make sense? That is rooted in the teaching of the prophets. Kohelet's a little fancier, and he's coming from his own perspective, which is about the accumulation of wisdom. But he's saying basically a different side of the same thing that Amos was saying. When he said, when Amos talks about how you deny justice in the courts and you trample on the poor in the streets, and then you go home and you say to somebody, bring me my wine. That's the prophetic vision of injustice. And Kohelet is building on that by saying the people who are doing that, they're not even enjoying the wealth that they're denying the poor. And so he ends the chapter with this teaching. And he comes back to something that we've heard before. Starting in verse 18, this is what I have observed to be good. Now, when Kohelet starts a sentence that way, you got to listen, because he hasn't seen anything else that was good since we started this book. So this is what I have observed to be good, that it's appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their work under the sun during the few days of life that God has given them, for this is their lot. That sounds more this is one of those that sounds more negative maybe than it really is. It's that this is the situation. This is your lot in life. You've got a limited number of days. Nobody really knows when the end of our days is going to be. And so if you're going to work, enjoy and share the stuff that you have. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot, and to be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. So it can seem a little bit in this book, in the first few chapters, like the only time God appears in the text is when Kohelet is blaming him for something. But here he's saying, look, if you can accumulate some stuff for yourself, and if you can enjoy it, and if you can maintain your covenant relationships, which mean basically that you're grateful to God and you're sharing what you have with people who don't have enough, if you can do that, that is a gift of God. That is, in other words, the way we're meant to live. And he says this at the last verse, verse 20. These people who are able to do that, who are able to enjoy their lives and enjoy their journey of faith during their limited days, those people seldom reflect on the days of their life. In other words, those people are not obsessed with increasing their lifespan as a reward for being good. They're not so obsessed with like figuring out every little thing that that they don't enjoy their life. They do enjoy their lives because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. When I said at the beginning that that Colette turns a corner here, it's a lazy corner. It's not exactly a right turn, but he's moving toward uh, after establishing the problem, which is that we work and we try and accumulate wisdom and we accumulate our stuff, and it doesn't really change the number of our days. After he's blamed God in the first 3 chapters for how the world works, Colette's coming back to the pack and talking about what it means to be in covenant relationship with God and with each other, what it means to love God and worship God sincerely, and also to be good stewards of the stuff we have and to enjoy the stuff we have. Nothing's more annoying than someone who has a lot, who always seems dissatisfied. Because at the very least, someone with a lot could share that with someone who doesn't have enough. All of those things would be living into our covenant relationship with God and with each other. The implication in that last part is that that enjoyment is a gift from God, that it's a blessing. And remember, anytime you hear that something is a blessing from God, you know in the covenant that you're called to share it. Remember, the covenant is, I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to all the nations. When we receive a blessing, the covenant reminds us of what we're meant to do with those blessings, and that is to share them with others. So Colette is turning a little bit of a corner here. He's moving to how to make sense of life in a world that doesn't always make sense. And some of it is basically to enjoy what you have, to worship God, and to be grateful to God for the gift of being able to enjoy what you have, and to also make sure you're looking out for your neighbors. The wisdom literature teaches about living covenant lives in community. Remember, in community, almost all of this is community. Ecclesiastes starts by saying how awful it feels sometimes to be an individual, but the remedy seems to be in our connections with other people. From chapter 4, it's about making sure that you have somebody next to you to be a friend and a support. And here, it's about making sure that you're looking out for people who don't have as much as you do. But it also comes back to covenant life as it was meant. So it comes back to covenant life as it was meant to be lived, which is in community. And I think just that's where Nick Cave got it right in there, even in his connection and his he says as he's getting older, more people in his life are dying, which I think is something all of us can relate to. So, but he's saying that you can either be stuck in the grief there, or you can balance that with the joy that it is, A, to be alive still, and B, to have remembered the joy of knowing that person. And to hear him say it, otherwise, joy doesn't resonate fully. Joy seems to leap forth out of suffering. In some ways, this Nick Cave is writing from a much more mature and well-developed view of the world than Kohelet. That's, we should have gotten somewhere in the last 2,500 years. And so he's writing something that I think Kohelet would have taken a Nick Cave book of essays and accumulated it into his wisdom. It's that good. But for us, we get to look at Ecclesiastes, and it points us in the direction of reading things like this and whatever other things have been meaningful to you in trying to understand how do you live a joyful life, not necessarily a happy life, but a joyful, a contented life, even in the midst of loss. Because we can choose not to do that, or we can choose to do it. The one thing that's true is that's the context for all of our lives. There are wins and losses. There are places of grief, and there are places of surprise and beauty and meaning. And a healthy life, and I think this is what Kohelet is trying to say, a healthy life learns to balance those. And so I think I'm going to end it there and let us. There's another section here, but I think I'm going to push that to next week. And let me take the mute off and hear what you guys have to say.
Well, John, your quote reminded me of another quote. I read a few lines. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. It's not the cup that holds your wine, the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven, and is not the lute that soothes your spirit, the very wood that was hollowed with knives. When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again into your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. You probably recognize that from the prophet.
Oh, okay.
From
it's been a long time, but yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Dale. It's clearly people wrestle with this, which is why there's so much good writing about it out there. Bert, I see your hand, but not the rest of you. There you go.
I'm having to broadcast this on my phone. The iPad isn't coming forth right now. If the chapter 1 was supposed to be an overture of this book, it didn't do a very good job. It didn't cover any of the joy that
no, it didn't. That's interesting that you say that, because it gives me a chance to teach just a little bit about the difference between Hebrew literature and Greek literature. And our English speaking way of writing is more tied to Greek literature than Hebrew literature. Hebrew literature oftentimes works in a triangle where what is said at the beginning, the high point is in the middle, not in the end. So let's say, and I don't know that Ecclesiastes is exactly like this, but let's say it starts in in chapter 1. The main point might be in chapter 5. And then, but it might descend back to restating what it said in chapter 1 in chapter 10. Does that make sense? It's like one side of an X, and that's actually the name of that kind of writing. It's called a chiasm, chi being X in Greek. And so it's Hebrews write that way. Oftentimes you'll see 10 verses. The main point is in the middle. And each of the verses that get there mirror the verses that are written after the main point. And so it doesn't surprise me that he doesn't tip off the joy in the first chapter. That's not the way Hebrews write. We would say, and I am an English major and my mom was an English teacher. We would say you got to have your topic sentence in the beginning. You got to say what you're going to say, right? Before you say it. That's not the way Hebrews write. And so you're right to identify that chapter 4 is, you're in the pit. But we're moving now to this middle part, which is the point. And I'm not going to tip it off, but there'll be some pit stops along the way before we get to the end again. So we think in a straight line, and Hebrews think in X's and circles. They surround an idea where we kind of say, I'm going to tell you 11 things about this, and at the end, you'll know about it. Sorry, Kathy, please.
Well, I just wanted to say, last week, this whole idea of being in a community kind of resonated with me. And then 2 different extreme stories I heard during the week. One of the people who were strongly in community and how they were doing very well. And someone who had isolated himself so much, they had no community. It was just such an extreme difference, but it just kept bringing me back to this, how important community was, that you had mentioned again tonight too.
Yeah. Yeah, Roger.
There's so much need in the world, and there's so many ministries, and it's just that who do you support? And I support Samaritan's Purse because they are right on the job, and they've got a 100% reputation if you go online to check their ministry. But we've also got the local homeless.
Yeah.
And we just got so many needs that how do we share it? How do we use wisdom to support who should be supported?
Yeah, well, I think the wisdom part, that's a great thing, but nowhere in there does it say solve the whole problem. To share your blessings, when God says, I will bless you and you will be a blessing to the nations, that doesn't mean that you individually or even this church has to be a blessing to all the nations. It's that if everyone who's reading that and is foolhardy enough to promise to do that, then a lot of it will get done. And so it's on the cynical side, it's easy to say, well, I can't do it all, so I won't do any. I'm pretty sure that's not the right answer. But I think for us, you're asking a really good question. You have to kind of discern, what can you do? But the key is to do something, to share that blessing somehow, and to trust that in God's sovereignty, that the multiple sharings of those blessings will meet the need in a meaningful way. At least some of it. Yeah.
One more thing, John,
Sure.
just to encourage you, my older sister had a triple bypass in her mid-60s, and she's 98 years old now and sharp as a tack.
I love stories like that. I love stories like that. That's great. Thanks, Roger. That's funny. Who else? Any comments? Any other questions about this? Ecclesiastes is becoming a little bit, he's less of a one-note pony here by the time you get to chapter 5. At least he's telling us to do some encouraging, positive things, like worship authentically or keep your mouth shut. Now, I would never presume to say that as part of the call to worship on a Sunday. But this Sunday I'm going to be thinking it. It's because because that makes sense, right? I mean, we've domesticated the faith so much that we come into church and we're polite and we sing our songs and we stand at the right time and all that. But I think, most of the literature, most of what's written about worship in the Bible isn't about how, it's about who you are when you worship. And so that's a good admonition for us. Clearly, Kohelet said, if it's not a promise you can fulfill, don't make it.
We just need to be okay with being messy, John.
Oh gosh, yeah. That never forget the mess. Roger, she's teasing me because that was part of the message last week, that things are messy. But I would much rather have a clumsy, disrupted, sincere attempt at worship than a perfect service that hits all the numbers and ends right at 11. Now, I take a particular satisfaction when a service goes well and it ends at 11. I can't lie, but that's not the point, right? The point is to be sincere and authentic and to express our love for God and our gratitude for God's grace to us. But it's not to say those things unless we mean them. And by mean them, I don't mean you're 100% sure that everything you believe is 100% true. It's a sincere struggle is better than a false certainty. And if Ecclesiastes teaches us anything, it's that not everybody who worships is happy with how the whole thing's being run. And by the whole thing, I mean world, not church. There's that too, but Larry, save me.
I don't think I can, but I guess what you showed us, the part of that chapter you showed us that was in writing, I guess I have a hard time visualizing joy that comes out of grief.
Yeah. Let me just look again at the words. Because if I read him right, and this is an interview, so this is off the cuff for him. This is not a written document from him, but I don't want to take him off the hook either. He said what he said. I think that he sees grief as grief and joy as joy, but that out of some of our suffering, we can emerge joyful at the others because of what we have gone through, or maybe in spite of what we've gone through. I think what he does say clearly here, and I think this part's true to me, is that unless you have a capacity to grieve, it makes it hard to have the capacity to feel real joy and to experience real joy.
I can appreciate that, but that's not quite what I got out of it.
Yeah.
Out of the depths of grief comes joy. I just
that's a tough
I
one.
think I've experienced that.
Yeah. We suffer as human beings, but out of that can come enormous joys and genuine happiness too. It can run in tandem with this ordinary sense of suffering. Yeah, it's a tough, that there's no doubt that's a tough line. But otherwise here's the thing. I think we renew, right? Like skin in a wound forms a scab and then a scar, and it bonds back together again. And you have that mark from that original wound, but you heal. And I would like to say that you will never hear me talk about closure in the way that people talk about it. Usually closure is a way of people accelerating through real feelings that they don't want to feel, or that they don't want someone else to feel. Because there were tragedies in our family when I was a kid that can still bring tears to my eyes. I don't have closure about that. I have learned to make space for grief in my life, which also has incredibly joyful places. So, within a 1-year span, I lost my dad and met my wife. I'm just one guy, but there's 7 billion stories like that. 8, apparently, according to the Times of London, said that.
Okay, well, I would interpret that as 2 separate events, not that one came from the other.
Yes. I see. Larry, I see exactly what you're saying, that those are 2 separate events. My sense is, and I don't know Nick Cave, but what I glean out of this is that because those 2 distinctly different events exist in the same person, that in the same sort of feeling center in a person, that somehow they commingle too.
Okay.
So you guys can correct me if that doesn't sound right, but that I'm not trying to homogenize this any more than it needs to be. Susan?
Well, I certainly seen throughout my life that people who've had a lot of grief, because it often changes their perspective of life and what's important, then they discover greater heights, if you will, or depths of joy. And I mean, I worked with the MS group for quite a number of years in this city, and MS is not a disease that anybody wants, and there's a lot of grief that goes with giving up control of your body. It's gonna fail you in some way, and you never know when and for how long and what part. But many of those people said to me, it has allowed me to have more joy in my life since that happened, and I'm glad that I got MS. I mean,
Wow.
blew me away, because all I can think of is how horrible that would be. But because of how going into that and really dealing with it opened them up to experience incredible wonders of joy. Maybe not happiness, because there were all still losses, things they couldn't do, but a lot of joy.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. That's powerful.
Mm.
Yeah. I haven't gotten to the I'm glad this happened yet. So
That's an after.
Yeah.
Glad that it happened now instead of being worse.
Yes, I am glad of that. And I had a really good conversation with my brother-in-law, who about 15 years ago, his GP said, "You got something wrong with your liver. I'm sending you in for a scan." And turned out there was nothing wrong with his liver, but the scan caught a shadow in his kidney. And it turned out he had a cancerous tumor in the center of his kidney that never would have been found until it burst out. And so within a month, they had removed his kidney, and the cancer it was completely encapsulated. Right. And so he and I were talking just about, this kind of a serendipity. I had an uncomfortable day in July, and that led to a series of tests that showed something that if I'd waited another 6 months, might have turned into a heart attack. So, Tim, please.
Well, I think this is appropriate to your last verse that you brought to our attention in chapter 5, verse 20. For he will not often consider the years of his life. Talking about you, John.
Yeah.
Because God keeps him occupied the gladness of his heart.
Yeah.
So I think it's an appropriate closing verse on today's lessons.
Yeah.
And that you brought all these riches and wealth to us here in this class.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That's good. If I was obsessing about what's going on, and it's really going on, and I do think about it, but if I were obsessing about it, which I think is what Kohelet's talking about in that passage, I wouldn't be here with you right now. I'd be rolled up in a ball, worried about, counting the 21 days until the surgery. And so this is better. This is better. And I have to say that as much as I have been distracted over the last couple of weeks, I look forward to Thursday evenings. I look forward to the prep, and I look forward to the conversation. And I usually look forward, once I get started, to me being done so we can have this part of the conversation.
We look forward to it too.
Yeah. Any other questions before we close? Yes, Judy, please.
Well, over my life, there have been some adversity, as in every life, I guess. What I have found, and this, I guess, is an answer to Larry, I don't believe that the joy comes because of the adversity. What I've experienced is that in spite of the adversity, there is joy. You can find joy. And I think those are two different things.
That I can associate with.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. Joy carries me through adversity, and so there's no permanent damage.
Yeah. And maybe in my description of that, I was leaving out a critical part of the equation, which is God's presence in our life.
Right.
There's a third party, there's a third sort of chemical in the compound that changes both our what C.S. Lewis used to call our cheap joy, that we're like a child that makes mud pies in the garden because we can't imagine a holiday by the sea. That's a C.S. Lewis line. Like he said, we're far too easily pleased. But maybe the and I'm not a chemist, so I'm fumbling for the right word. If it's a reagent or something that gets into the other things and changes them both. And so maybe our capacity for joy is transformed by God, and maybe our capacity for grief is ministered to by God. And so they're in the same person, so sometimes they share a boundary, but they are different things. But we don't want to leave God out of this. That's what Kohelet told us not to do.
In chemistry, it's called a catalyst.
Catalyst. That's much better. The last time I had chemistry was 1979, and so and I wasn't really paying attention then.
I was in the chemical corps and made nerve gas.
Oh, gosh.
We're going to save that for another conversation.
Yeah.
Let's close in prayer. God, thank you for these dear people. Thank you for the ways that we can join together in this technological way to explore your words and to see what you want from us and what you want us to learn from those words as we seek to be your people. Continue to mold us and break us and shape us and call us into your service. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, John.
All right, guys. See you Sunday.
Thank you, John. God bless.
Thank you.